Hi, and welcome to the Jejuporum 2021. My name is Angela Kane, and I'm the former United Nations High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, and I'm also the co-chair of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on the Korean Peninsula. And we have today's session, which is organized by the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Proliferation and Disarmament, the APLN, and it's part, of course, of the Jejuporum 2021. And the session title is the DPRK Nuclear Quagmire and the Biden Administration. And this is really a very exciting topic because, of course, US President Biden has announced a new Korea policy. He has unveiled this a couple of days ago, but we don't have a lot of details. So I look forward to discussing this with the panelists who are speaking today. And we really have three very, very excellent panelists. And I'd like to introduce them before I give them the floor. But let me share with you that what we will do is we will have each of the panelists speak for about 10 minutes each. And then we will have a question and answer period. And then we will conclude in the end and have exhausted the issue. I don't think so. But on the other hand, we will give you a good introduction to it. Now, the first speaker today is Dr. Frank Aum. He is a senior expert at North Korea at the U.S. Institute for Peace, and he oversees the work of the Institute on North Korea and focuses on way to reduce diplomacy, to strengthen diplomacy and reduce tensions. And he worked at the Department of Defense. He was a senior advisor on North Korea in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He has a very distinguished curriculum vitae, as all three participants have. And I'm just picking out some of the highlights as to what he has. He has a bachelor's from Dartmouth College, a master's from Harvard, and also a Juris Doctorate from the University of California. He will be the first speaker, and the second speaker is Professor Ding-Li Shen. And he is a former associate dean at Fudan University's Institute of International Studies, where he teaches, and he's an honorary visiting professor at Washington University in St. Louis. And his research and publication covers China, US security relations, regional security, and international strategy, arms control, and non-proliferation, many other subjects that are obviously very relevant to today's discussion. And he is also vice president of the Chinese Association of South Asian Studies. And he has a PhD in physics from Fudan and also completed his postdoc in arms control at Princeton University. And the third speaker is Professor Bong Jun, and he's a professor at the Department of Security and Unification Studies at the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security in the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. And he had several governmental and non-governmental positions, including as the advisor to the Minister of Unification, and his research covers the North Korean nuclear issue, inter-Korean relations, non-proliferation, nuclear security, and nuclear energy politics. So these are really very eminent professors and experts on this issue. And it's my great pleasure to now give the floor first to Dr. Frank Aum. Please go ahead.
Angela, thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank the Asia Pacific Leadership Network and the Jejuporum for inviting me to join this distinguished panel. So I think most of us, who care deeply about the future of the Korean Peninsula, US DPRK relations and inter-Korean relations, we've been waiting several months to see what direction the Biden administration's new policy towards North Korea would take. And now, having worked in the US government before at the Department of Defense, I knew that we wouldn't be getting many specific details of the policy because the US government simply does not share this type of information with the public. And this is because, one, the strategy is classified information. And then two, keeping the strategy somewhat ambiguous is helpful because it allows the administration to maintain a certain amount of flexibility. And then three, it just, being vague about the strategy helps to prevent exposure to criticism. So instead, what the US government does is they provide vague descriptions of the policy, which we then have to try and interpret. They use phrases like strategic patience or authentic and credible negotiations or maximum pressure and engagement. And in the case of the Biden administration, The phrase that they used verbatim over and over again by many different officials is a calibrated and practical approach. So let me start by describing what I think a calibrated and practical approach means. Biden officials are trying to present this approach as something new. They say, on one hand, it's not the sensationalized everything for everything grand bargain approach that was used by the Trump administration. And on the other hand, it's not the standoffish, nothing for nothing strategic patience approach used by the Obama administration. Instead, it's something in between. Well, an in-between approach is simply common sense diplomacy. It's diplomacy that is open to engagement with North Korea, that's conducted in phases, and that exchanges concessions in a reciprocal and proportional way. But this is not a new approach. This is, to a large extent, the same measured and realistic approach that was used by the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and even the Obama administration, at least during its first term. And I think this approach could be both good and bad. The good part is that the calibrated and practical approach has a track record of some modicum of success. It led to the agreed framework, which froze North Korea's plutonium reprocessing for 8 years. It led to more diplomatic progress during the six-party talks. And it even led to some short-lived success as part of the Leap Day deal and the Singapore agreement. So I think it's fine to use those aspects of the old approach that actually work. So that's the good part. But the old approach also has some potential problems. The first problem is that it maintains the framing of North Korea solely as a threat that needs to be deterred and contained, rather than trying to frame North Korea as a potential mutual partner that needs to be respected and heard. So from North Korea's point of view, this framing could be perceived as the US is maintaining its hostile policy. And I want to note that when President Biden spoke to the US Congress recently, there was only one line on North Korea, but he basically grouped North Korea with Iran as a serious threat that needed to be dealt with through diplomacy and stern deterrence. So not surprisingly, North Korea responded negatively. And to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if North Korea, if they viewed the pairing with Iran as something similar to President Bush's axis of evil line in 2002. The second problem with the old approach is that it tends to focus more aggressively on what the United States wants. Things like denuclearization, human rights, and having North Korea take the first step. But it tends to be passive and cautious when it comes to addressing what North Korea wants, including things like new US DPRK relations, a peace regime, sanctions relief, or even a moratorium on the deployment of US strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula. I will say, fortunately, I think the US and South Korea took an encouraging step during the summit, particularly in the joint statement, by reaffirming the Singapore statement and describing denuclearization and permanent peace as twin goals for the Korean Peninsula. A third potential problem with the calibrated practical approach is that it tends to be cautious and risk averse, and both sides are guilty of this. And this approach leads to both sides trying to maximize leverage before even getting back to the negotiating table, which often means that a crisis is required to precipitate talks. And we saw this in all previous instances where we've reached an agreement. So there was a nuclear crisis that preceded the agreed framework. North Korea withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that crisis led to the six-party talks. The two major provocations in 2010, the Leap Day, the Cheonan sinking and the Yeonpyeong-do shelling, That precipitated the leap day deal. And then, of course, the fire and fury and the advanced testing period in 2017 led to the Singapore summit and agreement. So I think, instead of wasting time and raising tensions and risks with this sort of maximizing of pressure and provocation cycle, I think it'd be a lot more productive to skip the crisis part and just get straight back to talks. So it's hard to say, whether the Biden approach will fall victim to these potential problems because, again, the policy was so sparse in the details. But there were encouraging signals, like I mentioned before, the reaffirmation of the Singapore statement, the immediate recognition that talks should start bilaterally between the US and DPRK and not try to go multilateral too quickly. I think history has shown that that tends to be the quickest path to getting back to negotiations. And then, of course, the description of peace and denuclearization as dual goals. But also, as I mentioned, the Biden policy appears to be cautious, risk averse, and conventional as well, by not offering unilateral conciliatory gestures, portraying North Korea as a threat, harping publicly about its human rights violations, and saying that the ball is in North Korea's court. The question now is whether North Korea is intrigued enough by some of these policy crumbs to play ball. I think the positive scenario is that Pyongyang wants more details than what was provided publicly, and it decides to take up the US offer for a bilateral meeting to learn more. The negative scenario is that North Korea decides that there's nothing new in what the US has offered, that the hostile policy remains, and that it needs to restart its testing cycle to increase pressure on Washington to change its offer. I want to close by reiterating what I said at the beginning. So we know very little about the Biden administration's approach, and what has been said publicly is just the tip of the iceberg. But the US and ROC governments have probably had lots of discussions beneath the surface about how to move things forward. So I think we'll have to wait and see what happens over the next few months. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank. That was really very, very good. And I particularly like the fact that these are policy crumbs on the North Korea policy. And I want to just observe that, of course, both President Biden has had long experience, of course, in foreign policy and has dealt with the North Korea portfolio before, as is Tony Blinken, which I think is very significant also. But as you point out, there is an advantage in not giving enough details and leaving it open and calling it practical and calibrated, but on the other, which can be open to a lot of discussions and a lot of interpretations. But you pointed out also the dangers that it has when you leave it at that ambiguity. And so now we have to see how North Korea is reacting and whether they take up the offer of the bilateral meeting as that was offered or not. So I thank you very much for that excellent introduction to the topic. And I know that there will be a lot more to be said about it. So it's my great pleasure now to give the floor to Professor Ding-Li Shen. And I turn over to you for your presentation. Ding-Li, please.
Thank you very much, Angela. I would much agree with Frank, as he has said, we are not clear what the Biden government would say to North Korea. I heard something, probably rumor, that North Korea has rejected Biden government's approach. Let's talk. North Korea did not give positive response. North Korea did not care to talk to the US. Maybe this is a wrong story. Maybe it's right. But I don't believe this. If North Korea has rejected the US, I don't believe this is the true intent of North Korea. What the North Korea want to do is to keep a nuclear weapon and also to build a good relationship with the US. What China would say, to have both fish and the bear pond. They may not be able to achieve it, but they must want to do it. And let's look at, to predict what Biden would do. let's briefly review what the 4 previous US presidents have dealt with North Korea. Clinton almost done. He sent Madeleine Albright to Pyongyang, and North Korea was interested in having Clinton. But the Clinton, for domestic politics, he did not have the courage to go to Pyongyang to codify a deal at an early stage before North Korea tested the long-range missile and nuclear weapon. Of course, if he would go, if North Korea would agree, and North Korea could still break, not observe its commitment. But I think we would have a far better chance to rock the DPRK before it would move forward. And next president, better luck, 911. He addressed North Korea along with Iran and Iraq as the axis of evil. And that only threatened North Korea to feel US is its arch enemy. And the US war, which was unwarranted against Iraq, US may make sense for its war against Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and in Afghanistan. But the war against Iraq had no UN endorsing and no evidence to support. Saddam was unwelcome, but it's up to Iraqi people to deal with him. And before adequate evidence to launch a preemption, which was not legitimate. So North Korea was scared, or they would find good evidence that their nuclear weapon pursuit is justified. And then President Obama, as Frank has mentioned, strategic pensions, just leave them aside so they would come back with a second thought. That has never happened. Despite China-US cooperation in the Security Council to sanction North Korea one after another, nothing happened. They retaliated China by testing more long-range missiles and testing more rounds of nuclear devices. China-US cooperation failed. And then Trump, initially fury and fire. And the second, 3-1 meeting in Singapore, in Hanoi, and in Panmunjom. No one would predict such a strong-willed president would suddenly change his mind. But he really did not show his leadership, because at a time when Kim Jong-un has promised to its confidant and people that after the visit to Hanoi, things would change toward a positive direction. John Bolton torpedoed President Trump by presenting new evidence through US intelligence that North Korea may secretly launch the new program. In addition to those known programs, North Korea may be willing to abandon some or all of them. North Korea is starting some secretive program. North Korea is for sure to do it. Or they want to have both fish and bear pond. If they abandon fish, they must keep some bear pond. They cannot abandon everything, waiting for US to give them everything after they abandon everything. What if US would give nothing and they abandon everything? Every sensible people would prepare for the worst. Trump should listen to John Bolton, but not take Bolton's ill advice. And Trump rejected it. So that second round meeting, which was supposed to draw a roadmap, collapsed. But Trump still met Kim Jong-un in Panmunjom, but nothing happened. He could be the person to make nice things to happen, which is US gives something, North Korea abandons something, the more US give, the more North Korea would abandon. Then North Korea would more secretly develop a new program, and the US would keep watch, would want it, would always pressurize it, but never demand for North Korea to abandon everything overnight. I think the former Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, used to say, take pragmatic steps toward an ideal objective. Ideal objective is North Korea abandon everything. But the pragmatic approach is that they would take 5 years instead of one night. And the US should give some carrot, and South Korea and China could give something. But the US resolutely said no. So now let me turn to the main subject. North Korean nuclear program and its future and its Biden government. Again, I agree with Frank. Biden would do something. He would do something. He would not repeat Obama to do nothing. And by doing nothing, you would only wait and see the growth of North Korea's nuclear weapon program. So you have to do something. But to demand, ideally, you get nothing. So he must not repeat exactly the same approach as Trump has demanded. Abandon everything and the US give everything. He knows it is not pragmatic. So most likely, he would do something in between. That is, North Korea abandon something in a transparent way, in an open way, to tell it is genuine. And before it would abandon everything, the US, China, the United Nations, and everybody would do something. And this may be a second step. The first step is that they announce something, but they would never announce everything. They would conceal something. So we should say, thank you, welcome, but you bear a consequence if we find something you intentionally concealed. And we will be able to tell them you are bad. They say, I'm sorry, because I don't trust you. We say, please abandon through a roadmap. Second year, they abandon more and we give more. Third year, they still retain something and they secretly started new thing, and we will not be able to find everything they are secretly developing. But if they would if we would review their program, they are bad. They could lose everything. So they must be very cautious to do something and don't do a lot. And we should be prepared that the overall roadmap could be developed over a time frame, probably 10 years, 20 years. So what if they keep 1 or 2 nuclear weapons? They cannot launch it first, as they would commit suicide. So we should have patience. After Clinton has lost his precious chance, after Obama has been reluctant to approach them for 8 years, and after Trump doing nothing, wavering from two extremes, it's time for us to realize we are not almighty to force them to abandon everything. North Korea must have 2 calculations. One, they have more sophisticated program than it was 10 years ago. Second, China-US strategic competition would make China most likely unwilling to force them to abandon everything before US would give something to them. They're sure China would back them, no matter they keep nuclear weapon or not. And they believe the US is in its worst shape, and probably will keep this for the next 10 years. One, political polarization. Except for the issue of China, the US has 2 extremely opposite political spectrum. Second, economic diversification. With globalization and the US, rich people are getting richer and poor people are getting poor. US rich people are investing in China, they are unwilling to return. They could open a new factory in the US, but they are unwilling to return. Even the US would pay them the money for them to go home. And they may remove the headquarters from US to Hong Kong, don't pay the tax to the US. Therefore, American government would have increasing economic difficulty to have its resource to disperse among poor people. And third, racial issue. It's lingering, it's still there, it would not finish overnight. And all these three issues would continue at least for the next 10 years. So US cannot negotiate with a position of strength. Secretary of State Blinken told his Chinese counterparts, Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Mr. Yang Jiechi in Anchorage, Alaska, 2 months ago, to say US would negotiate on a position of strength. But everybody knows US now that cannot negotiate on a position of strength. And North Korea has more sophisticated nuclear weapon program, is restraining, not testing long-range missile and not testing another round of nuclear device. How can you wage a war against them? And they have China's backing if the US would continue to strengthen its security grouping with a so-called Indo-Pacific security mechanism. So China would work with Russia, Pakistan, Iran, North Korea, and the US would work with India, Japan, Australia. So this is the best time for North Korea not to give a good deal to the US, and North Korea would squeeze the best from the US. This is what I can guess a sensible North Korean strategist would think. And also the US strategists would think about North Korea and about themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ding-Li. That was extremely interesting. And I really appreciate also the fact that you opened the lens a little wider and brought some history to this and talked about the Iraq War, for example. And also, again, just like Frank did about the axis of evil, which was now, 30 years ago. So that's a long time. But also to talk about the motivations of what would actually happen if there was such an opening, and what could the steps be and what would the reaction be. So I think that was really very good. Now we have our next speaker, and that is Professor Wongum John, and I would turn over the floor to you, please.
Thank you, Chair. Let me begin by thanking APLN for inviting me to this timely and significant session on North Korean nuclear issues again. In this short 10 minutes, I will talk about 4 topics very briefly, each of them. How this US-Korea summit was perceived here and how I evaluate them. Secondly, how it's going to be received by DPRK. And thirdly, what's going to happen to US DPRK nuclear negotiations. And then lastly, some general lessons that I have learned during the last 30 years of nuclear negotiations. Let me first begin with how this was perceived by Korean government and by Koreans who are generally supporting inter-Korean dialogue. This outcome of this summit was overall very positive for creating an environment for the resumption of US DPRK dialogue. In the joint statement, it didn't mention CVID, it didn't mention denuclearization of North Korea, sanctions, maximum pressure, stick and carrot, all options are on the table. They didn't say that. Instead, it supported US DPRK Singapore joint statement, inter-Korean Panmunjom declaration, inter-Korean dialogue, inter-Korean cooperation and the family reunion. And also, in addition, a US special representative for the DPRK affairs was appointed early, while a US special envoy for North Korean human rights was not yet. However, I don't think these positive outcomes and good gestures from the US would lead to any positive response from DPRK. The summit was successful in putting a brake to the backsliding US policy on North Korea. And its outcomes, however, its outcomes still far short of North Korea's demands for during the last 2 years. I don't think, again, North Korea is starting either its infamous brinkmanship diplomacy anytime soon. DPRK is not going to welcoming it. Also, it's not going to start, nuclear or missile test anytime soon. Since last December, there were widespread predictions that North Korea will return to its old habit of nuclear and missile provocations, so-called brinkmanship diplomacy, against the new US government. And the US may return to strategic patience policy of Obama era. However, at the time, I wrote and I predicted that North Korea will pursue strategic patience. This is what North Korea will do. And the US will do strategic engagement with several good reasons. Since I don't have time, I will not get into that. I think I was right so far, but I now predicted that things could change for the worse this fall. North Korea is still waiting Washington's answers to the North Korea's demands for corresponding measures and their demands for new calculations since the Hanoi fiasco. North Korea may see all these positive elements from the Washington summit for granted, and will be more watchful of those threat elements, such as human rights problem, strengthening alliances, deterrence capability, as was mentioned in the joint statement. One scenario that I concerned the most is that both US and North Korea believe that the ball is on the other's court. In this case, the result will be strategic patience and the nuclear and the war crisis again, even if US doesn't want to repeat that. I think those are very predictable results. Then how do we avoid this pitfall? I think both sides have the boards on their hands. If they want to play a game, both sides have to deliver boards to the other side. It still takes the two to tango. Then who will be the first mover? We expect the DPRK should be the first mover. And the Secretary Blinken already mentioned a couple of times that they could wait a few more months. But I think that's not a good idea. If the US wants to have an interim nuclear agreement, I think it could be reachable. It could be reachable. I think if we are going to make a first stage or interim nuclear agreement, I think we could make some package by both DPRK and the US side somewhat in an easy way. North Korea could put all those ongoing and early denuclearization measures that already has done by them. Moratorium, shutdown of nuclear testing sites, shutdown of missile engine testing sites, and also shutting down Yongbyon complex as was proposed by the DPRK at the Hanoi. That could be exchanged from the US side, an early and partial diplomatic normalization, and the early and partial peace regime building, and the partial sanctions relief, and also a little bit of nutritional and public health assistance. If we just aim lower than very high, I think all these things are already on the table. I hope that we start the negotiation this summer or fall, early fall, with the target date of a conclusion of this kind of a very early stage or interim agreement before February 2022 Beijing Winter Olympic. If we are just putting together all those things already on the table, we could, I think, somehow come to a conclusion somehow easily than I think. In order to make this my wish come true, I hope that President Biden writes a letter addressed to President Kim, delivering his intention to succeed Singapore joint statement and proposing a working level negotiations to implement those 4 goals from the Singapore joint statement. I hope that this personal letter gives President Kim an excuse to reverse his current belligerent position. Most may think that this letter writing is an impossible mission, but I don't think so. I want to remind that President Obama initiated the communications in 2015 with the Iranian president and the Iranian religious leader, despite a very strong domestic criticism and oppositions. Without these highest level political communications, JCPOA might be impossible. So I think this kind of a letter writing, though it may not be easy thing, I'd like to hear from Frank how that's feasible. But I think this could be very significant. There could be a price that that we have to pay in order to have a DPRK nuclear freeze and an early start of denuclearization process. And just let me add very lastly, as Frank mentioned, there is some cycles in this our 30-year-old nuclear negotiations with the DPRK. In my accounting, all nuclear negotiations start with the DPRK provocations, serious war crisis, and then negotiations, agreement, and then finally the collapse of agreement. There were already 7 cycles. We might be entering 8 cycles. I hope it should not happen. It should not happen, but there was during the last 30 years. And also during the last 30 years, DPRK nuclear capability have increased tremendously. In my very rough calculation, DPRK nuclear capability doubles every 8 years. So if we waste another a few years, DPRK nuclear capability would increase further. So here's my final word. It's always cheaper today than tomorrow if we have to pay somehow for the nuclear agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jun. We've had some really 3 very substantive analytical presentations, and I'm very happy that you all took different parts to this as well. So that was really very, very good. I had to smile at your suggestion for President Biden to write a letter to Chairman Kim. I think that was very innovative to think about that. But on the other hand, let me just go back to something that you all agreed, and that is that basically Biden is now putting the ball in Chairman Kim's court, saying, I'm willing to engage, but it's up to you to really come to it. And the difficulty with that is, of course, that there has not been any concession offered by the United States, i.e. sanctions relief, which we know very much the DPRK wants. So what could be done, in fact, to advance this a bit? Or what are your thoughts about what could be done in terms of the sanctions relief? And of course, there's both the sanctions on the US side, but also the sanctions from the UN side. And particularly because we know that to engage in diplomacy, particularly in the times of COVID restrictions, is extremely, extremely difficult. So how could that possibly be done? How could that possibly be started? And maybe, Frank, I can start with you, if you would mind picking that up, please.
Sure. So I think, again, there were some positive signals, more in the declaratory sense in terms of the reaffirmation of Singapore and how we phrased the goal of denuclearization, particularly elevating the goal of peace. So I think those are all positive. It was clear that they weren't going to, the Biden administration wasn't going to provide sanctions relief or partial sanctions relief up front, but it has stated before during the presidential campaign and also in the early parts of the administration that it's willing to consider the right formula of both sanctions relief, but also sanctions enforcement and potential exchanges, right? Other potential concessions, a willingness to discuss an end, a declaration of an end to the Korean War, ending the travel ban to North Korea, again, a potential moratorium on deployments of US strategic assets to the peninsula, humanitarian assistance, particularly related to COVID vaccines. There's any number of things that can be provided, right, as gestures of goodwill. But I would agree that at this point, the ball is in North Korea's court because they were waiting to hear what the policy of the new administration would be. Now we have it. It's not, again, not a comprehensive detailing of the policy, but this is what you're going to get from the Biden administration, at least publicly. So I would think that in North Korea, it would behoove them to say, okay, it's a little tantalizing, but we're still not clear. Let's at least meet bilaterally, get those details. And then if it feels like, okay, it's nothing new, then they can decide then the next course of action that's appropriate for them. But I think, again, there's enough there that should draw them back to the table.
Thank you, Frank. Does Ding Li or Bong-gun, Dijun, would you like to weigh in on this?
I think Trump's interaction with North Korea has awakened China to make China reappreciate the strategic importance for North Korea's role in China-US endless frontier strategic competition. So probably China would think no matter North Korea abandons nuclear weapon or not, as long as it would not use nuclear weapon against me, I can tolerate. And as the UN does not prohibit humanitarian aid, primarily food aid, China has enough food for DPRK. No matter you build a nuclear weapon or not, you would not collapse. If the US is determined to contain China, and China would need its friend, and North Korea is a more than obvious partner for China in dealing with the US. So North Korea may think this is the best time for North Korea. North Korea needs both fish and bear pond, needs both nuclear weapon and food. It has already nuclear weapon, as Bong-gun has estimated every 8 years, North Korea's nuclear capability would be doubled. They want to double without being hungry, and China would feed them. So thank Trump to make China to reappreciate North Korea's strategic importance. So China would feed North Korea anyway, with or without it's abandoning a nuclear. So the ball, instead of being on the North Korean side, in my view, North Korea must think it's in the US side. North Korea would not abandon nuclear. So if the US would have another round of strategic pensions, that would be best, because that only would push North Korea to have more nuclear weapons, get more food from China. So North Korea would have no choice but to support China. It would not play a unique role to waver between Washington and Beijing. So the best choice now is Biden don't talk to North Korea to give North Koreans legitimacy not to abandon nuclear weapons. And they are not hungry. If Biden would talk to them, Of course, they want to be friendly with US and they are willing to abandon them, but they can raise the demand high. What the return Biden is willing to offer without enough enticing offer, North Korea would be very much refusing in order to push Biden to give a better offer. I think they have this idea. This is the best time because Trump has educated Beijing, don't abandon North Korea. And Biden and Trump is calling China to have some racial 种族灭绝 extinguishment in for those Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and to beat China on the issue of Hong Kong, and to give weapon to Taiwan, and all this convince China that the US is enemy. So why I have to push North Korea away from me? I think if I were North Korea, I would think best time ever, better than Obama, Trump, Clinton. This is best because the racial issue, the political diversification, and the economic disparity, plus COVID. So North Korea has a big advantage vis-a-vis the US. They are on upper hand.
Thank you very much, Xingli. And I think you had already said at the beginning of your statement first that you had heard a rumor that the Koreans were actually rejecting the approach. And I hope that that rumor is wrong, and rather that one would counsel strategic patience to wait on both sides, not to hasten anything that could lead to, let's say, not very positive effects. But let me go to Bong-gun. Would you have something to add to this issue?
Yes, I want to just add a couple points. Just let me admit, and let us admit that both DPRK and the US are very difficult situation domestically to take any initial or first move. It's politically very unpopular in both sides. But however, as was mentioned earlier, that DPRK was in that position for a while, but now US has some new position. So I think DPRK could come to the table just to listen to, not to negotiate, just to listen to what the US want to say. I think in that sense, it should be in that way. And also US, it's very difficult to provide any assistance or any sanctions relief, but bilaterally. But if it's in a regional or some other multilateral sense, DPRK is in a very difficult situation in public health, corona responses, COVID-19 responses, and the food and the nutritional situations. So if we are hearing and using WHO, WFP, and we could work with the DPRK to provide some assistance, I think that certainly would provide a much better environment to jumpstart dialogue.
Thank you very much. And I want to stick for a minute with the bilateral relations between the US and the DPRK before we broaden the page a little bit wider. But you know that there has been a new envoy who was designated by President Biden just a few days ago, Kim Sung. And he is the envoy, he's got a lot of background experience, etc. And I just wonder what you think he could do. But I also want to say that what Bong-gun said, and that is that domestically, I think in the US, it's very difficult right now for President Biden, because I think not only he, but both sides, of course, have to see that something comes out of it that is positive, of this engagement. But on the other hand, with the JCPOA negotiations and the recent announcement by the Director General of the IEA that Iran has actually enriched up to 60% the uranium, which is an extremely high number, I think there will be tremendous pressure on President Biden to come forward with an agreement, not only on Iran, but also to look at the situation with DPRK. And I think that puts a very different dynamic into all of this. So do you think the appointment of the special envoy could have something to do with this, or what is your view of this? Maybe I'll start with Dingley this time, just move it around a bit.
For first time, China-US now have had their own 2+2 talks, not the defense and foreign minister 2+2, but foreign and security officials to talk to each other. To what I know, they worked on Iranian nuclear issue, climate change, Burmese military junta, and post 9/11 US GI's withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I also heard they have talked about DPRK. So for what the US new envoy could do, liaise between US, China, South Korea, Japan, and Russia. Those are stakeholders. But the primary China, to hope China would continue to pressurize DPRK. First, not to redo nuclear testing. Second, not to relaunch long-range missile. And third, to freeze their nuclear status. And fourth, not to be too hardline against Biden. And this is exactly what the US is asking China to do on US return to JCPOA, so China can do something to leverage Tehran. And China has no chance to refuse. China has to work because China does not want to have Iran to have nuclear weapon. Iran's uranium enrichment has reached, to its own announcement, 60%. Not 19.5%, it's 60%. It's very, very close to nuclear weapon. If the US would not return and nothing of the UN sanction would be lifted, China would give bilateral economic aid to Iran, and Iran would go ahead with more closed status, close to near nuclear weapon program. And Iran would be another North Korea. And Biden does not want to be blamed for that. So US want to return, but the US say you don't be associated with Hamas, etc. Some deal would be concluded. So Iran makes some concessions that the US would return, with Iran agreeing with some new condition. And the US would abandon all precondition beyond JCPOA. So this is what I would predict. Iran would use its nuclear competence to pressurize the US, and the US would still get something with China's help. Again, on North Korea, US would ask China to pressurize North Korea, and China would indicate, don't pressurize me. So some deal may be made between China and the US. So the US envoy would meet with Chinese counterpart, and probably a string of meeting would happen. In the best case, North Korea would reluctantly agree to work with the US. So that would be a nice start. But if the US would pressure China more, and China would be very unwilling to see the US and North Korea would meet again. So China would do something, so they would not meet. And that would make US bad. Nothing would happen for Biden. So Biden has to do something, not to be strong, but not to be too soft. And China had to do something to create a cooperative mood between China and US for the US to reduce pressure on China. So we are somewhere in between the two extremes, the breaking away of China and US and the incremental improvement of China and US, but never back to 4 years ago. So let's see. The envoy is an envoy. He would implement the president's intent. Neither Obama nor Trump do something. Henry Stevenson said, pragmatic steps. So China, North Korea, and US, and possibly South Korea could define what is the pragmaticality, the roadmap, step by step.
Thank you very much, Ding Li. I must say that I'm sure that it's going to be very closely watched by DPRK what's happening with the JCPOA. And I think that was also one of the issues when they looked at the Trump administration, because he was very easy to just kind of abrogate arrangements and agreements that have been made. So what does the word count? But on the other hand, I think that you are right in that the cooperation also with China and the US in the JCPOA, as well as on nuclear matters in the NPT, for example, I think is helpful, as it is with the other powers that are involved in it. Maybe I can turn to Bongun Jun. Do you have something to add to this?
Yes, I just want to, the so-called Iranian denuclearization model, I just want to make a couple of points. That's a very a hot topic, and everyone talk about how we could apply this Iranian model to. But having this phased step-by-step approach is okay. But otherwise, if you are just thinking of the wholesale Iranian model, it's not going to apply to DPRK. In that sense, we need specifically Korean Peninsula type denuclearization model. But in case of Iran, there was it's kind of a regime change. Ahmadinejad was changed into Rouhani. They have a democratically elected president. They have an open economy. So it's a completely different situation. And and also here is another some factor is Corona, COVID-19 factor. Could be more significant than we just casually talk about. DPRK has just shut down its border for over a year, and I thought that still people there are a lot of coming in and going out, but some people who are knowledgeable about the DPRK were saying that this is literally shut down, so no one is coming in, no one is going out. So in this situation, even if they want to have this dialogue, how could we have? Of course, you could use New York channel, but it's going to be very limited. And my last point is that Sung Kim is a very knowledgeable ambassador who is ready to jump into negotiation without any preparation. Previously, President Trump was not ready. This secretary was not ready, and the big one was not ready. It took years for them to get the knowledge. But nowadays, Biden, Blinken, Sung Kim, who are very knowledgeable on the issues, so they could be jumping into as long as there is a dialogue. But the problem was that in case of DPRK, it's a still presidential agenda. They somehow have to recognize that once they have a Singapore agreement, they set the goals by the president, then that's it. Then they have to delegate their authority for the further negotiations. But I think it's going to take a little time for them to do that. Let me start.
Thank you very much. I still wonder whether it is not a good idea to nudge the issue of engaging in discussions with the US and the between the US and the DPRK by offering some kind of enticement. I don't really see any enticement rather than conditions as to what has to happen. And, like, for example, the sanctions issue could be one of them on the US side, not on the UN side, because that would be more difficult to achieve in the short run, but on the US side, that could be one of them. But let me ask Frank, what you think of that, and also about the efforts of the new envoy who was appointed, who incidentally, I understand is going to be part-time. It's not a full-time position.
Right, so really quickly on Iran, Secretary of State Blinken, prior to the administration, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, basically arguing for an approach that would be similar to the JCPOA approach. So an interim deal like the JPOA that eventually provides the space to reach a more comprehensive JCPOA. So it's clear that the Biden administration is looking at that sort of interim deal process. Regarding Sung Kim, I can see it both ways. On the positive side, certainly there was a lot of pressure for the Biden administration to name a special envoy or special representative for North Korea policy. They've named special representatives in other areas, so it doesn't make sense that they wouldn't name one, especially during this very momentous occasion. And Sung Kim is not only an excellent diplomat, but he is the most knowledgeable diplomat in the entire US Foreign Service on North Korea. He's been working these issues for decades, including when he was a special envoy during the six-party talks. Remember, there was a picture of him carrying the boxes of declarations over the DMZ line, I think back in like 2007 or 2008. So he's been doing this for many years. That's the positive, that we're trying to send a message to North Korea that we're serious about engaging. And because we're serious, we're putting in our top diplomat, right? The negative side is that, one, he was the former special representative for North Korea policy between 2014 and 2016. So he's basically taking the same position that he had part-time that he did back in 2014, which was the height of the global pressure campaign by the Obama administration against North Korea. So North Korea can see that and say, okay, you're putting in someone who was the lead diplomat to pressure us. That's not a positive sign, right? Two, like you mentioned, this is part-time. Ambassador Kim is dual-hatted as the current ambassador to Indonesia, but also doing North Korea policy. That's how you're gonna show us respect, by giving us a part-time position. North Korea can't be happy about that, right? So, and then overall, I think this is also indicative of whether there's actually a new approach from the Biden administration, because you have Sung Kim, who had that same exact position in 2014 and 2016. You have the nominee for Assistant Secretary of State, Dan Crittenbrink, who was the senior NSC Asia director in 2015, 2016. Secretary Blinken, who was one of the architects of the pressure approach to North Korea in the Obama administration. Avril Haines, Sid Seiler, who's now the National Intelligence Officer of North Korea, but he was the North Korea director at the NSC. So you basically have the old band getting back together again, right? So that raises the potential criticism of, if you have the old band, can they play new tunes, right? That would be the concern, I think, from North Korea. And then the last point I would make is that North Korea cannot be happy about the status quo. Sure, it can trudge along using covert smuggling, other illicit activities, cyber attacks to gain some currency, and getting humanitarian assistance from China. But that can't be the ideal path forward for North Korea. They don't like the status quo, and I feel like they probably at some point want to disrupt the status quo. The question is how they do it. Again, one way is to try to pressure the US by conducting provocations and disrupting the status quo that way. The other way, ideally, is through diplomatic negotiations. What I would hope for is that something like, at least at a minimum, the working level negotiations that was conducted bilaterally in October 2019 in Stockholm, I believe, where after Hanoi, the two sides met and they're trying to see, okay, have things change. Unfortunately, North Korea didn't like what they heard from the US, and then after that, it was the end of diplomacy. But I think, again, both sides, it's incumbent upon them to meet together, see where they're at, take a stock of what both sides' position is currently, and then determine the next way forward. I think that would be the best approach to take.
Thank you, Frank. I appreciate your giving us the background also on Sung Kim. And, there are always two sides of a coin. And the one side is that, yes, he's associated with a certain policy that he represented before and with the Obama presidency. But on the other hand, as we all know, it's very helpful in diplomacy if you already have had previous contact, FaceTime, and you basically can better assess who your counterpart is in terms of, if you are willing to engage in discussion and in negotiations. So, that's the good part, of that, what could happen. But I take your point, and I do agree with you, and that's why I mentioned the part-time issue, because I do think it's a bit of a, how shall I say, a negative aspect of this whole item is like, what do they think? Let me ask one last question, and then we're going to have to wrap up, because we've talked primarily now about mostly bilateral issues, but what can other countries contribute to this? I mean, I know that South Korea, of course, is very committed, China, but Japan is very engaged in the issue, and of course President Biden already had a meeting with Japan on this. I don't even want to get into the whole issue of the missiles, but on the other hand, what can other countries contribute to the issue to nudge both sides to basically start a more productive way forward? And maybe I'll start with Bong Gun Jun, please.
Yes, in fact, the reason why DPRK going nuclear was, someone saying that, very, analyst in Korea was saying that there was, going back to 1980 when Korea was succeeding in diplomatic normalization with Russia and China. DPRK couldn't. So now it's time go back to that period, and we need to diplomatic normalization between U.S. DPRK, DPRK and Japan. Only that kind of normalization could be a background and the necessary condition for the denuclearization of DPRK. Of course, we cannot have normalization first, but there should be some parallel progress. And also, we are, in fact, the Korean government is of the position that all countries in the world should be talking to the DPRK, should be coming to the international society. And the one thing that could be some opportunity factor is that all Korean watchers, North Korean watchers here are saying that Kim Jong-un wants to be a very normal leader, political leader of a very normal country. And we know DPRK is not a normal country, and Kim Jong-un is not a normal leader, but somehow he pretends he want to be something. So by using that kind of his desire, we could, make some better background to push it toward the denuclearization. And I just want to very quickly about Frank point that Obama era, there was a strategic patience, a maximum pressure toward DPRK. But in my observation and analysis that policy was not Obama's original policy. DPRK was, in a power transition period from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. There was no way for them to engage with others. They have just internally focused. And at the time in Korea, we have a very conservative government who want to exercise maximum pressure to the DPRK. On the other hand, Obama wanted to have a diplomatic normalization with all former, enemy states, hostile enemy states like Cuba, Iran, Myanmar, North Korea. He succeeded in talking to all those leaders except DPRK because there was a DPRK problem and also, but now things could be changing.
Thank you very much. And I'll turn over to Ding-Li, please.
South Korea used to play a very critical issue to bridge the US and North Korea for Trump and Kim Jong-un. But its effort has failed. Given the last year in the government for President Moon Jae-in, North Korea may think South Korea is in a weaker position because President Moon wants to have some credit for his presidency. So South Korea needs to give more to North Korea. North Korea would never change government. So they need to, they are not in a weaker position. They have nuclear weapon, they have China as a friend, and they see a weakening US and a weakening South Korea. So this may be North Korea's view. And South Korea really is in a hurry to get something done. I don't think South Korea is now irrelevant. North Korea really care South Korea. North Korea would hope South Korea can continue to play a role. They needed South Korea more than they needed Beijing. But as China is a foreigner, and South Korea is still their sibling, and they hope South Korea would play a more trustful role, not to follow the US, but to soften Biden's position. So Biden would give more to North Korea, and North Korea would truly get both fish and bear pond. So in my view, South Korea still holds the key. The key is not with Beijing, but South Korea. North Korea intentionally raised the bar high to tell you you are irrelevant, because you are relevant. They say you are irrelevant. Then you have to give them more. So South Korea need to do a better job, a more skilled diplomacy, because this President Biden used to be vice president of Obama. He knows why Obama failed. He wants to beat Obama to get something done. So he is better than Obama. And South Korea now has lifted itself to treasure the last year available. So why not to have genuine talk with the White House to facilitate the talk between Pyongyang and Washington? So Pyongyang would abandon some with verification. And US would not demand DPRK to abandon all right now, but at least to announce a list and to receive a good verification. But understand they would conceal something. This is something that South Korea need to present to the White House. So I hope South Korea would do it. Don't abandon your effort, and let the Korean inter-Korean issue to be commanded by Korean people, not to be commanded by people outside of the peninsula.
Thank you very much, Shingli. Let me mention something else, and I think that's really relevant as well. And that is, you said that President Biden wants to kind of do a better job, let's say, than President Obama. But on the other hand, most likely President Biden, considering his age, will be a one-term president. And I think that also empowers people to be a lot more forthcoming, to be a lot more, let's say, innovative in terms of what they want to do, and a lot more powerful in trying to push through their policies. And I think we've seen that already. So that, to my mind, augurs also well to have something that is a bit more, let's say, it's a little more daring than the regular status quo, or just progressing the policy that was already. Frank, you started the session, and I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're going to have to close. If I may turn over to you then.
Thank you very much. So first, I agree with Professor Jun that there were structural factors that prevented the Obama administration from engaging more than it wanted to, including the power consolidation that was happening in North Korea, but also the conservative South Korean administration's Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye that made it more difficult, right? But I think the bottom line is that there was a 6-year period from 2012, the end of the Leap Day deal, to 2018 Singapore meeting. That 6-year period was the longest period over the last 30 years in which the US did not have sustained engagement with North Korea. And that period, that 6-year period, coincided with the greatest advancements in North Korea's nuclear weapons programs, 4 nuclear tests and over 80 ballistic missile tests. So to me, it's clear that pressure and isolation does not work as a policy. There's empirical evidence that we have, right? That's point one. Point two, I disagree with Professor Shun a little bit in saying that South Korea has more to do. I think President Moon has done about as much as he can. I can't think of what more he can do over the last 3-4 years in really advocating and promoting a peace-based approach to North Korea, that all the intermediate role that he played in getting the two sides together. I think he is to be commended, and I'm pretty sure that he probably applied a full court press, to use a basketball analogy, on the US to get them to adopt, reaffirm the Singapore statement and present a more good faith approach to North Korea. So unfortunately, I think South Korea has run out of road. They've done everything that they can, but at this point, it's really a US-North Korea game that we're talking about here. Everything that North Korea wants, only the US has control over. Sanctions relief, a less hostile US policy. China has no control over that. South Korea has no control over that. It's only the US that has control over what North Korea wants. So the US really needs to engage. I also think that China can do a bit more here. If China wants to be perceived as an international leader, right, then it needs to do more, because North Korea is its ally, because North Korea is its friend, I wouldn't necessarily say to pressure North Korea by, clamping down or cutting off oil or not providing humanitarian assistance. But at a minimum, China needs to tell North Korea, hey, you should meet with the US, hear what they have to say, right? China has at least that amount of leverage, right, as a partner. So I think that's something that China can do more of.
At this vicious, nasty competition time, I personally want China to do great, but I do suspect whether China would do it. Or probably China just wanted nothing would happen. If nothing would happen, that would squeeze the US. So why we hope China would do the best? I personally expect that China would not do it, as China views North Korea and the Korean Peninsula as a part of its global game with the US. And China suspects South Korea would be successful. China really don't like President Moon Jae-in's bridging. That's why with my sincerity, I hope South Korea would not feel frustrated. And it would still do, even though China is unwilling to do. So I personally still hope China would do. But that would happen at a time when China-US relationship would be more stable, would not return to normal, but still would be much more proactive. Then China would do something. China is very strategic, as the US is.
Thank you very much, Frank. I know that Frank wanted to do a very, very quick, because I'm being urged already 3 minutes ago to wrap up totally. So very quick, very quick sentence.
Yes, so the concern is that if we don't get back to talks, then North Korea will conduct provocations. That continues the security dilemma of more military ramp-ups, also including potential things that China doesn't like THAAD deployments in South Korea. So it's in China's interest to prevent that from happening and get North Korea back to talks.
I'm sorry we don't have more time to also explore other countries' positions. I think we focused only on the few that are basically around the table. There could be others like Russia and some more countries that could come in on this. So we don't want to single out anyone in particular. But my point was really that there really should be a lot of nudging to get DPRK to engage and to basically take up on the invitation. And that I think that there is a wider responsibility there than just between the US, obviously, and the DPRK, but also those countries that have very strong relations with it and that are clearly interested in geopolitical stability. Now, I must say that I've had a great time enjoying hearing you and hearing the discussions. I thank you very much for participating in today's session, and I think it was a great pleasure for me as a moderator to run it. And I want to thank particularly the APLN for organizing it and the Jeju Forum for the wonderful opportunity that we are given today. And I hope everyone has a good evening. So thank you very much all for participating. Bye-bye.